following on in a similar theme with respect to the resource area and information in the care of children. Pamela Perera is a clinical nurse educator at the Northern Hospital, which I naively don't know which state it's in. I think it's Victoria. Yeah. Pamela's work is around that challenge that I think everyone has in the resus room around ensuring that that scribe nurse role is fully executed, and that at the end of that whole resus situation, appropriate transcription of what happens has occurred and everything that needs to be is documented. I know one of the biggest challenges in my department is medication reconciliation at the end of a resus, and making sure that that loop is closed around drugs that were taken out of the scheduled 4 or 8 cupboard, and also any other drugs that were given, because most of the orders are verbal and we continue to grapple with that. So Pamela, I'd like to welcome you up here. I'm hoping that what you present is something I take away and implement tomorrow.
Everyone. So I'm Pamela Perera from the Northern Hospital. Today I would like to introduce you to our pediatric resuscitation scribing tool, which some of you would actually have a copy of in your hand. So a little bit about our hospital. So we're a hospital out in Victoria. We're currently one of the busiest, we are actually the busiest emergency department in Victoria. And in the last financial year, you can see we saw about 92,000 patients through our doors, including adults, pediatrics, and obstetric patients. Out of those 92,000 patients, 19,000 of those were actually children walking through our doors. The beauty about our hospital is we do have a separate treating area for our pediatric patients with its own waiting room. We are seeing a growth about 20% in our pediatric populations per year now, so we are growing pretty big for our department. The department has about 57 beds, 5 resus rooms, 48 adult cubicles, and as I said, 9 pediatric cubicles. All our really sick kids go to our resus rooms, and each resus room is dedicated to both adults and pediatrics. So back in 2015, part of a quality and improvement project, we saw the need to actually create a platform or some form of medium for our nurses to actually document during resuscitation. We wanted to improve the consistency of documentation, and we also wanted to provide a systemic approach to actually documentation. So the chart took about 18 months to develop, from creating it, trialing it, and endorsing it. The project was led by the pediatric education team, the emergency department education team, and also the pediatric medical team. We were well supported by the quality and safety department and Standard 8, which is the clinical deterioration committee. We also did a little bit of digging around. We went back to a couple of our case reviews and actually looked at what we actually needed to improve before we actually created the chart. So let's take a little bit step back. So who are actually our scribe nurses? So in emergency department, quite often our scribe nurses are the nurses working in resus. But let's look at it a little bit broader. If you've got a couple of resuscitations going in, sometimes the role of a scribe nurse actually falls on slightly junior or novice nurses. So we needed to consider, while creating this chart, we needed to know who our scribe nurses were, and we were going to create a chart for the entire hospital. So wherever there was pediatrics, this chart was actually going to be used. So that included the emergency department, the Jones unit, and also outpatients. So when you look at the nurses working in those departments, we had a varying skill mix. Varying registered nurses, both adults and pediatrics. Also, during our case reviews, we unfortunately looked at some of our resuscitations, and we saw that in each section or each department, sometimes we were having retrospective documentation, insufficient documentation. Unfortunately, sometimes documentation was actually written on any medium that they had, including paper towels, scrap paper, and progress notes. We also identified that some of our novice nurses did not understand terminology that we use during resuscitation. So then we thought about what other benefits can we actually put in this chart to actually help our nurses. So we're in a hospital where we see both adults and peds, so sometimes swapping brains between an adult and a ped in a really, really stressful situation can actually make you a bit more anxious. So we thought, all right, we'll put in a couple of these things. So we thought about the shockable and non-shockable pathways, pediatric waist-bait formulas, reversible causes of cardiac arrest, time and loops of cycles, compression ventilation rate. We've got 3:1 for neonates, 15:2 for pediatrics, and then 30:2 for adults. Our age groups, so we need to think about our neonates right up to children of 17 years of age. Defibrillation equipment, so we have manuals in AED, but we have AEDs in the ward. And we needed to provide a systematic approach to the primary survey. So this is our chart. It's an A3 chart. It looks a little bit busy, but I'll walk you through it. So we wanted a one-stop shop chart. So accountability. So this part of the chart, when we were looking at some of our case reviews, we couldn't actually identify who were actually involved in resuscitation. So we thought, okay, we're going to make this a little bit better for us. And we've done a lot of work in the ED in terms of who the scribe nurse is, who's going to be taking over airway, who's going to be procedure nurses. And so if we had the luxury of already allocating prior to resuscitation, beauty. If not, what we've done now, as soon as we have, in the event, we will just take our roles. And this makes it a little bit easier for our scribe nurse. Most of us have got stickers on our arms with our names. So for a scribe point of view, they know who's actually doing what role. We've also given a little box, you can see the code blue criteria. So we're giving our nurses a little bit more of help in terms of actually calling a code blue. We don't really need to wait for someone. They've got criteria there. If the child fits the criteria, we'll call a code blue. So these are some of the prompt boxes, some handy hints for our nurses, regardless of what skill mix they are. If you can take the appreciation that sometimes it is difficult for us to quickly calculate some of these drugs in terms of weight. So all of that is provided for them in the one chart. So this is the primary assessment part of the tool. We put a lot of tick boxes and a lot of time slots so that it took ease out of the difficulty out of scribing. Scribing actually, if it takes time and experience to actually learn how to scribe beautifully. However, we decided, no, resuscitation goes really quickly. We're going to do tick boxes. So if you notice, there's a lot of tick boxes against a lot of terminology. So even our novice nurses who do not understand terminology, well, it's there for them to actually tick a box and actually write some times. It's also part of safety. If you look at airway, if an ETT goes in, there's certain boxes that needs to be ticked, and that's a safety point of view as well. That gives the scribe nurse to communicate with the team leader and make sure that intubation is safely done. This was the hardest part of the tool to actually create. It took me a long time to actually create this part. Quite often people get very nervous during resuscitation, and if we all know, most of our pediatric resuscitation falls under the non-shockable pathway. Keeping times of loops, keeping times of next rhythm checks is actually quite difficult when you're scribing. It's clear cut here. All you have to do is write a time and tick the boxes. And it's right there for your team leader and for you to go, right, next rhythm check. We're in loop number 2, we're in loop number 3. What drugs needs to be given? We also found that a lot of our senior nurses, especially in emergency and ICU, actually love scribing. So we had to provide ample amount of space for our nurses to scribble. So we also included our ARC flow chart here to the non-shockable and shockable pathways, and that's also your 4Hs and 4Ts, your reversible causes, for a little bit more prompting. We found that scribe nurses worked very closely with the team leader, and so by providing it right there for them, they could communicate with the team leader and get things going. So we trialed the chart. So we had about 39 nurses from across the hospital, including ICU, special care, general theatres, ED, and the children's ward, trial this chart. We did it during mock code blues within the departments. During mock code blues, we wouldn't call it as a mock, we actually called it as a real code blue. And we did real-time simulation in those wards. During the teaching programs, what we did was a group of educators would do real-time simulation of a cardiac arrest, and we got about 8 to 10 nurses to scribe in real time and actually use the tool. We only gave them 5 minutes to look at this tool, and we went for it. So you can't quite clearly see this chart, but what we found was our novice nurses, our junior nurses, nurses that did not do resuscitation on a daily basis, really favored our tick boxes. It made it simple for them. It took the stress out of them. It gave them power to actually talk to their team leaders in terms of what else needed to be done. Our senior nurses from ED and ICU did not use our tick boxes, but scribed. They just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. But what they did was, retrospectively after that, they went back to our tick boxes and made sure that everything was actually done for safe resuscitation. The most useful part on either board of the all skill mix said that they really liked the non-shockable and shockable pathways, because keeping time of loops was really important, and keeping track of what drugs needed to be given was the most important part for them. It was easy for them to just look and talk to the team leader. So back in October 2016, the chart was finally endorsed. It provides our nurses with a really good platform to actually scribe, regardless of what skill mix you are. It has improved the standard of documentation. We've found that people have now, our nurses have a new realization how hard scribing can actually be, and by using this chart, it's actually empowered them a little bit. And it actually also complies with our ARC guidelines. The end. Any questions? Yes?
Does your department have electronic documentation?
No, we don't.
Have you thought about what you would do in the future if you do transition to electronic documentation?
Not sure. I think we're still quite far away from going to electronic documentation, but yes, obviously we will have to think about what we would do then. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
So you want to? Yeah. Fluids, are they documented on a separate?
No. So fluid orders will be documented somewhere else.
Yeah.
But the fluids that we give will be documented there.
So where do you document that? Just in your?
In your written part.
Just in your written part.
Yes.
Okie dokie. Okay, Ta.
I'll come to you. Thank you. Thank you. That was an excellent speech. I work in a hospital with predominantly an adult centre, so something like this for paediatric arrest would be really helpful. I just wondered what would happen in the event that was a prolonged arrest or there was more than 5 cycles of CPR, or your experienced nurses who do like to run out of space.
We might go back. So if you look under the 5th loop, it says that we're going to need for you to actually pull up a second chart. And we do appreciate that sometimes our pediatric resuscitation can actually go for about 40 minutes to an hour. Unfortunately, yes, you will have to pull up a second chart or a third chart to keep going.
Can I ask a question? I'm excited by this because I've been working on a statewide paediatric scribe chart that came sort of essentially from Sydney Kids, where we've had one for many years. And there's fantastic elements about this that I think are really great. The thing that I wanted to ask you, just because challenging when I've run some sims in the wards, is that with a big chart like this, what do they lean on to write? And it's a bizarre sort of thing to ask, but in our department, we've got these scribe chart, sort of, what are they, tables. So we've a bit like, you've got plenty of space to put it out on and write on. But in the wards, what I noticed is they sort of had nothing to write on.
True. And we did do mocks in the ward, and what we found was the nurses would grab, so in the back of their resuscitation trolley, we actually had those boards, and it was attached to a board, so they'll just grab the whole thing and start scribing on it. But in ED, we do have our big tables where you can start scribing on.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You mentioned that you were catering for experienced nurses and novice nurses. Did you have a look at, or did you have it reported if the novice nurses felt an increased confidence in their resuscitation skills?
Yes. So during our simulation sessions, where we had a group of ED nurses, or a group of educators actually performing the simulations. After that, we went to individual nurses and actually spoke to them regardless of what skill mix they were, and we actually gathered all written documentation back with us so I could actually look at it. And the novice nurses really, really appreciated, as I said, the tick boxes here. Even if they didn't know what an LMA was, it was there, they could tick it and time it. What we found was our novice nurses did not scribe. They did not know what they were writing, when they were writing. So that was one of our biggest consideration, is to match both experienced nurses and unexperienced nurses. And so you found that a lot of the ward nurses just used a lot of the tick boxes, and then when they thought it was not there, they would actually scribe and actually write what they needed to write. Yes?
These are obviously really helpful in an arrest type scenario for a resus. I was just wondering, do you have a separate chart if you have a paediatric trauma resus? Just wondering how you go about documenting like on a body chart type stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
So currently our NUM from our department is actually here, and I think she's just created the adult version of a trauma chart. Once that's up and rolling, we will actually consider a paediatric one.
Just wondering, so you mentioned you had quite a diverse sort of presentation mix, and I know that you've got a big obstetric population as well, and I imagine that you sometimes have some birth before arrivals in the emergency department. So obviously newborn resus is quite different from a neonatal resus.
Yes.
How have you sort of adapted that, and do you have a separate team that come from the maternity unit or the obstetric unit to respond to those?
So as soon as we know if there's a birth coming in, we will obviously contact obstetrics and midwifery, and quite often sometimes they will provide us with a midwife, but quite often our births are actually in the car park, which I've run to a couple of those. And there's a cohort of nurses in ED that are neo first response trained. So, and most of our doctors are also, have some experience with neonatal. So we do have a resuscitator, and we do have our flow chart as to what we do with our neonates that are being born. The chart can be used as well for neonates. So there's a section up top if we're actually using a neopath to resuscitate a child that we can tick.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
We have included in our chart, I think it's just died. Died. We've included in our chart more track and trigger. So, graph, because we felt that was what nurses were used to doing in the wards, because we all track and trigger with our observation charts. Had you thought about doing that and discarded that, or was that just not a thought to include?
So we do have track and trigger charts. So we use the Victor charts in our ED in Victoria. So what we do is, as soon as the child is actually now in resuscitation, the Victor chart gets put on hold, and we go back, we start this chart. If the child is Ross, and then we'll swap back to our Victor charts. Yeah.
I
hope you weren't wanting to
Thank
take
you.
home your. Maybe we'll
I'm not
option
sure.
them. The plastic. Thank you, Pamela.
You.